The next step is to determine if we can actually run this test or not. And this all depends on the number of website visitors and the number of conversions going through your test. Now, a rule of thumb is that you need at least 1000 visitors and 350 conversions for each test variation in your A/B test. But the fact is, I barely see these numbers work. To make these numbers statistically valid, you need to find a big uplift in your conversion rates. The change you made in the variation needs to result in a huge increase in your conversions. If you work with 1000 conversions per test variation, you need to find an uplift in your conversion rates of 10% to make it statistically valid. And 10% is of course big. That is huge. Just imagine 10% extra revenue coming in through your website. I have seen it happen in some A/B tests, but it is not very likely that you find an uplift of 10%. Now, when you work with 10,000 conversions per test variation, you can detect an uplift of 1% in your conversion rates, and this is statistically valid. Now, this all has to do with statistics. The more website visitors and conversions going through your test, the smaller uplift you can detect in your conversion rates to make it statistically valid. Besides these numbers, you also want to run your A/B test for full business cycles, for full weeks. So run your A/B test for at least 1 week to a maximum of 4 weeks. You don't want to run your A/B test just in the weekend, for instance, because the behavior of your website visitor can be very different on a Monday and Tuesday. So the change and the impact you see in your A/B test in the weekend could very well be very different for the other days of the week. Now, you also don't want to test any longer than 4 weeks, because people delete their cookies. If you test for longer than 4 weeks, there's a big chance that a visitor will both see the variation and the control, for instance, because this person deleted their cookies. And this pollutes your data and makes your results less trustworthy. To calculate the number of visitors you need in the test, also called the sample size, and to calculate the test duration, we will use a very useful and free tool from abtestguide.com. Now, before we start filling out the numbers, and we will do so for our test for Bookabuzz, we first have to be familiar with some of the terms in the tool. Let's start with one-sided versus two-sided. One-sided means that the change caused by the variation is either bigger or smaller than the conversion rate in control. So when you're optimizing for transactions, you want more transactions. And with the bounce rate, you want a lower bounce rate. So with one-sided, it is either bigger or smaller. And this is what we usually use in our A/B tests. Now, for some reason, you might have an hypothesis where you don't know if the change is bigger or smaller. It could be both. Well, in that case, you will use two-sided testing. But in 99.9% of the A/B tests, you will use one-sided. Now, the power is the likelihood that your experiment will detect an effect when there is an effect to be detected. Now, this might sound very technical, maybe a bit confusing, but this is all you need to know, because for A/B testing, we set this to 80%. Now, the power is dependent upon the sample size, the effect of your test, and the confidence interval. But for A/B testing, we always set this to 80%. Now, the confidence level is the percentage of times your experiment will show the same results when you repeat the experiment. So it's the percentage of times your results will hold true when you repeat the A/B test. So if we set this to 90%, in 90% of the cases, the result of the A/B test will be the same. At this stage, you don't want to put this number below 90%. If you do so, there might be a chance that the increase you see in your variation is caused by chance and not by the actual change you made. So set this to 90%. So one-sided versus two-sided, power, and the confidence level. In the lecture resources, I'll place a link to an in-depth article. But for now, let's calculate the sample size and test duration for our Bookabuzz test. Alright, let's calculate our sample size and test duration for our client logo test. And to fill out these numbers, let's set up a simple custom report in Google Analytics. And perhaps You already created such a report when covering the research section of this course. Now the only thing we need is the number of users and the device category. Now let's click Save. There we go. And add a new segment right here. And first, we want to know the number of visitors on the test page. So let's go to Conditions. Get the page. Right here. Exactly matches the slash. So now we get the number of users who visited the home page. So let's give it a name. And click Save. And here we have the numbers. Now make sure that the time period is set for 1 week. Because if we check A/B Test Guide, it asks us for the unique visitors on your test page per week. Now we want to run our A/B test on all devices. So the total number of visitors is 15,000. But there's one thing to note, because we want to see segments as well. And we want to at least segment for desktop traffic. So we need sufficient data to see statistically valid differences on desktop. So let's work with this number, 10,000. And let's fill it out in A/B Test Guide. So the unique number of visitors on the test page per week is 10,000. Next, we need to know the conversion rate in control. And for this, we will set up a new segment. And in this case, we need a sequence. Because first, we want our visitors to see the home page. And next, we want to see how many of those converted. So this can, for instance, be a visit to the thank you page. Or maybe in your case, it's a page with success in the URL. If you have e-commerce set up, it can also be transaction per session is greater than 0. And of course, it can also be a goal completion. So again, let's give it a name. And click Save. And here we have the numbers again. And as we are working with desktop traffic for the segmentation, we need this number over here, which is a conversion rate of 21%. Next is the expected improvement over control. So how much do we think the conversion rate will increase due to the changes we are making in the variation? And the default is 15%, but that is a lot. That is very high. So it should definitely be lower than that. And getting this number right in the beginning is very difficult, because this number is not fact-based yet. If you run a lot of A/B tests on your website, you can use the average uplift of your test winners as the expected improvement over control. So if the average uplift of your A/B test winners is 3.2%, then you would fill out 3.2% right here. But as we did not do any testing yet on bookabuzz.eu, let's stay on the safe side and let's set the expected improvement to 5%. A 5% increase in conversions is still quite nice. In the next lesson, I will elaborate a bit more on this expected improvement. The last field is the maximum number of weeks for the A/B test. And this is optional. So let's set it to maximum of 2 weeks. Now the hypothesis is one-sided, the power 80%, and let's set the required confidence level to 90%. And now we can check the minimum sample size, which is 13,812 unique visitors per test variation. And to get these numbers, we have to run the test for 2.76 weeks. And as we want to test for full business cycles, we round this up to 3 weeks. Now the minimum improvement needed, based on the maximum number of 2 weeks for the A/B test, is 6%. Now if we run the test for longer, let's say 4 weeks, we have more visitors in the test and we can detect a smaller effect, in this case 4%. Whereas if we test for 2 weeks, we can detect a difference of 6%, which is statistically valid. But as we stated that the expected improvement over control is 5%, the test duration for this A/B test is 3 weeks. And that's it. The test duration is 3 weeks and the minimum sample size is 13,812 unique visitors per test variation. Now keep in mind that this is the absolute minimum sample size. If you have more traffic, do not be modest here. You want at least this amount of traffic, but more is always better. If you want to do segmentation or find a smaller uplift in the conversion rates, which is still statistically valid, you need more data. So please don't be modest here. This is the absolute minimum sample size. Preferably, you want this a lot higher.